It was 10:07 a.m. on a Tuesday when my Outlook crashed for the third time in the middle of another pointless meeting. Mark was rambling on about pivoting synergy frameworks, reading directly from the report I wrote as if he'd just discovered fire. I sat there, face blank, but in my head, I was burning the whole building down with a stare and a cup of stale coffee. I'm Hazel, 48, 3 decades in tech, and somehow still explaining database indexing to men who think cloud storage is just Google Drive. Mark still introduces me as the coding gal, like I'm some sideshow act with a laptop. What they didn't know is that while they were busy printing emails and high-fiving mediocrity, I was quietly building something in my garage. Something that worked. Something they didn't deserve. I named it Janus, not after anyone they'd know, but after a Roman god who sees both past and future. Fitting, really, because what they couldn't see was that I was done waiting for recognition. I didn't build this system for the company. I built it to survive them. And when the moment came, I would make sure they understood exactly what that meant. They didn't know about Janus yet, but I was already 3 versions deep before anyone at Bringer Solutions had even managed to define what a digital transformation roadmap actually meant. I didn't need a team or a budget or permission. I had a second-hand ThinkPad, a garage that smelled like old paint and ambition, and a spreadsheet full of every dumb thing Mark had said in meetings. Janus wasn't born from inspiration. She was built from rage. Every time the CRM system randomly assigned surnames like a confused game show, every time an invoice vanished into the Bermuda Triangle of our legacy database, I didn't complain. I just opened my private GitHub repo and coded like hell. No applause, no Slack threads, just me and the keyboard at 1 a.m. lit by the cold glow of a monitor and the hotter glow of fury. My name is Hazel, and while the company thought I was fading into irrelevance, I was quietly rewriting the laws of enterprise logic from the floor of my own home. This wasn't some passion project, it was a lifeline. They thought they could ignore me, but I was building a system they would beg for. Janus could detect anomalies before they surfaced. She could reconcile data across platforms that didn't even speak the same language. She was multilingual, self-healing, and adaptive. And best of all, she was mine. Not Bringer's, not Mark's. Mine. I didn't use a single company resource, not a server, not a dollar. I paid for everything myself. Patent filed before the first line of code. Development logs time-stamped, notarized, and backed up to an encrypted drive that needed my fingerprint to access. I knew how this game worked. I'd played it long enough to see how they steal your brilliance and call it collaboration. Once, I'd built a reporting tool that cut 10 hours off weekly analysis. Mark pitched it at a conference like it was his epiphany, and I got a thank you email with a smiley face. That smiley face still haunts me. So no, I wasn't going to let Janus be absorbed into the machine. I wasn't going to let them rename her Bringer Sync and hand Mark another plaque while I got a $25 Starbucks card. This time, I'd built the trap before the bait. I watched them flounder in meeting after meeting, fumbling through systems that barely held together while my solution sat quietly in my garage waiting. All I needed was the right moment to show it to them, not to impress, to corner them. To remind them that sometimes the person you ignore the longest is the one who holds the detonator. I didn't build Janus for praise. I built her for revenge, for proof, for legacy, and most of all, to make sure that when the storm finally hit, they'd realize too late that I had been the weather the whole time. The opportunity came disguised as desperation, like it always does in companies run by men who confuse confidence with competence. Bringer Solutions was bleeding contracts after their latest software patch failed across 2 client regions and 3 verticals, and suddenly everyone who used to ignore me in the lunchroom was asking if I had any insights to share. Mark called an emergency town hall with the subtle panic of a man who just realized his golden parachute might be filled with bricks. He introduced Project Avalanche like it was going to be our redemption. A system overhaul that would supposedly integrate all departments under one seamless architecture. Seamless, he said, like he hadn't just described every internal failure we'd suffered for the past 5 years. And that's when I knew. Avalanche wasn't a solution. It was a cry for help, and I had already built the answer. So I let the silence hang after his presentation before I stood up. One hand on the edge of the conference table, voice calm. I said I had something to show them. Mark smirked like I was about to suggest a new filing protocol. But then the lights dimmed, and Janice lit up the room. She mapped data in real time, predicted bottlenecks, corrected legacy code without human intervention, and interpreted regulatory compliance standards across markets. Every exec leaned in like they were witnessing magic. But it wasn't magic. It was math. It was logic. It was mine. They clapped like children watching a magician pull a dove from a sleeve, and Mark, never missing a beat, turned to the room and said, "This is exactly what I've been hoping someone on my team would build." That sentence, that smug theft dressed as leadership. I smiled politely and said nothing because I wasn't ready to play my hand just yet. Let him think I was flattered. Let them all believe they could absorb Janice the way they'd absorbed every good idea this company ever had. They didn't realize Janice wasn't a product. She was a Trojan horse. I had given them a taste, just enough to make them dependent, just enough to watch them rearrange their entire infrastructure around something they didn't own. I returned to my desk while the meeting room buzzed with excitement, my inbox flooded with calendar invites from execs who suddenly remembered my name. They thought they'd found their savior. They thought they'd discovered the one brilliant tool that would fix everything without realizing the system wasn't the solution. I was. And soon, when they tried to claim what wasn't theirs, when they reached for Janice like she belonged to them, I would show them what happens when you mistake the architect for an employee. They wanted salvation. What they'd get was checkmate. 2 weeks later, the contract came sliding across my desk, wrapped in artificial praise and veiled threats. They called it a formal integration proposal, but it was just a corporate leash dressed in legal jargon. Mark's signature was already on it, bold and smug at the bottom of the page, as if he'd authored the future himself. The document outlined how Janice would be absorbed into Bringer Solutions' core infrastructure, how the intellectual property would be transitioned seamlessly to internal oversight, and how I would be promoted to Director of Systems Innovation, reporting to Mark, of course. I read every line slowly, letting the audacity settle. They hadn't even tried to hide the theft. In their minds, Janice was already theirs, and I was just a lucky staffer who'd finally earned a seat at the table. But I'd seen that table. I knew what happened at it. Ideas were drained dry, credit was shuffled like cards in a rigged game, and people like me were patted on the back just hard enough to keep us from noticing the knife sliding in. I didn't tear the contract. That would have been too dramatic. Instead, I picked up my pen, uncapped it, and wrote one sentence across the top of the document in clean, steady cursive. See patent number 94277-886, filed May 3rd to 2, under Hazel R. Chen. Then I stood, walked into Mark's office without knocking, and laid the paper gently on his desk. His smile faltered the moment he read that line, his eyes scanning for some escape clause that didn't exist. I told him calmly that Janice had been built entirely off hours, on my own equipment, and had been legally protected before the company ever even knew her name. I watched his throat tighten as he tried to respond, but no words came out. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply said I was willing to license the system, for a price. Not for a role, not for recognition, but for ownership, complete and undisputed. That was the moment I saw it flicker in his eyes. The fear. Not of me, not of what I'd built, but of what he couldn't control. He realized, in that silent moment, that he'd underestimated me, not just professionally, but existentially. He'd thought I was the support beam, always there, always reliable, never demanding space. But I had become the structure itself, and Janice was the blueprint. When I walked out of his office, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The leverage had already shifted. I wasn't asking for a seat at the table anymore. I had brought my own table, and they were about to find out what it felt like to beg for a place at mine. The first offer arrived less than 24 hours later, cloaked in polished language and inflated numbers, as if they could distract me with zeros. It was a licensing proposal that dangled equity like bait and promised collaborative oversight from a panel of executives who had spent the last 3 years pretending I didn't exist. They called it a strategic partnership, but I knew what it really was: a velvet-wrapped acquisition attempt. They wanted Janice, but more than that, they wanted to erase the fact that she came from me. I didn't reply. Not at first. I let them sweat. I let the silence speak louder than any counteroffer. 3 days later, a second proposal came. This time with a personal note from the CTO, full of flattery and forced humility, trying to position themselves as visionaries eager to uplift internal talent. I laughed when I read it. These were the same people who once told me, "You're too technical to lead," and now they wanted to co-author white papers with my name on them like we'd built this together. What they didn't know was that I'd already started negotiations with their competitor. Titan Axis had been circling for months, quietly watching Bringer's slow collapse from a distance, waiting for exactly this moment. I scheduled a call with their CEO, shared a demonstration of Janice tailored to their systems, and watched his eyes widen as she stitched together real-time operations in under 5 minutes. He didn't ask who built it. He asked what I wanted. And I told him. A clean license agreement, full public credit, a launch under my name, and a clause that explicitly barred Bringer Solutions from ever using or modifying the platform. He agreed in under a day. The press release was already drafted. When it went live the following week, Bringer's executive Slack channels imploded. The words developed independently by Hazel R. Chen were highlighted in every tech blog from San Francisco to Singapore. Mark didn't call me. He didn't email. He didn't even send a department-wide memo. He just vanished from the meeting schedule for 3 days. But I heard the fallout. I heard how 3 major clients pulled out within hours of the announcement. I heard how compliance started sniffing around old expense reports. I heard how the board demanded an emergency audit of Project Avalanche, only to discover it was still nothing but a buzzword on a slide deck. And I sat in my garage, same desk, same keyboard, same coffee mug, watching the empire I'd once held together in silence begin to unravel thread by thread. I didn't need revenge. I'd already won. All I had to do now was wait for the final thread to snap. They tried to recover with PR spin and frantic investor calls, releasing a vague statement about internal restructuring and a mutual decision to part ways with key leadership, but no one was buying it. Not when Titan Axis had just announced an exclusive multi-year deal with me at the center of it. The news cycle fed on the contrast like wolves to blood. Bringer's failed promises against Janice's lightning-fast rollout with their biggest rival. What stung most for them wasn't just the loss of the system. It was the exposure of their lie. For years, they had cultivated the illusion that innovation came from the top, from boardrooms filled with buzzwords and whiteboards. But now the world knew it came from a woman they once called redundant. And as reporters started digging, the cracks widened. Former employees began sharing their stories: how credit was siphoned upwards, how women were sidelined during product launches, how department heads recycled rejected pitches from junior staff and claimed them 6 months later. It became a movement, and suddenly, Bringer wasn't just a struggling firm. It was a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, I didn't just license Janice, I evolved her. At Titan Axis, I wasn't asked to justify every decision. I was funded, supported, and trusted. Janice was no longer a prototype. She became a platform. We built out modules for predictive compliance, live vendor audits, real-time operational mirroring. In 6 weeks, we onboarded 3 multinational clients, all of whom had left Bringer. Every integration came with a clause. My clause. That Janice would always bear my signature. That no derivative system could be attributed to any entity but Hazel R. Chen. And the market responded like it had been waiting for this shift all along. My inbox changed. It was no longer full of passive-aggressive reminders or redundant meeting invites. It was full of venture interest, keynote invitations, women in tech panels, and quiet DMs from employees still trapped inside Bringer, asking if there was space for them here. And I remembered their names. I remembered who listened when no one else did, who nodded in meetings but stayed quiet out of fear, who sent me side notes after presentations to say, "I love that idea. I just couldn't say it out loud." I reached out. I hired them. I built something bigger than a company. I built an escape route. Bringer tried to sue, of course, claimed violation of non-competes and misuse of internal tools. But their case collapsed the moment my legal team submitted the original patent, time-stamped and notarized, weeks before any employment clause could touch it. And with that, the final thread snapped. Their stock plummeted. Their board scattered. Mark's resignation was buried in a weekend news cycle with no fanfare and no severance. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. Because this wasn't revenge anymore. It was reclamation. I hadn't burned their house down. I had simply built a better one, and everyone saw the difference. I thought the story would end there, with Bringer collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance, and me finally free to build without interference. But stories like these always have one last twist, and mine came on a rainy Thursday morning, wrapped in a federal envelope stamped with quiet menace. A subpoena. Not from Bringer, but from the Department of Corporate Ethics and Trade Oversight. They were launching a formal investigation into intellectual property misconduct, citing anonymous claims that Janice had been developed using confidential Bringer datasets. The irony was suffocating. I had gone to obsessive lengths to keep Janice clean, to separate every line of code, every test case, every algorithm from anything remotely touched by company resources. My personal laptop had timestamps, backups, mirrored logs. But Bringer wasn't aiming for truth. They were aiming for delay. They knew the weight of an open investigation could stall any expansion deal, scare off new clients, muddy my name just long enough for them to regroup. And for a moment, I almost panicked. Almost. But then I remembered. I had built this system not just with intelligence, but with foresight. I had anticipated their pettiness, so I did what they never could. I opened everything. I granted the federal team full access to my development archives, gave them signed third-party verification of the original patent logs, provided time-coded videos showing the earliest versions of Janice running on my garage server, down to the blinking lights on the router. Transparency wasn't a risk. It was my shield. The investigation dragged for 6 weeks, during which Titan Axis stood by me without hesitation, publicly affirming their trust and even fast-tracking an internal ethics audit of their own, just to show solidarity. Meanwhile, I went silent. No press, no panels, no posts. I let Bringer scream into the void while I stayed calm, collected, untouchable. When the final report came in, it was scathing, but not for me. The agency concluded that not only was Janice developed independently, but Bringer had demonstrated a pattern of suppressing internal innovation and misleading stakeholders about project timelines and talent attribution. The real twist? That anonymous complaint had been traced back to Mark's former executive assistant acting under orders. He was trying to buy time for a merger negotiation behind the board's back, and when it failed, he tried to bury me in the fallout. Instead, he buried what was left of his career. The investigation closed with no charges against me, and a formal reprimand issued to Bringer Solutions, effectively blacklisting them from future government contracts. I didn't hold a press conference. I didn't post a victory thread. I just sent one message to my team. We're clear. And with that, the next chapter began. not in response to an attack, but on our own terms. Because when you own your work, your name, your legacy, no amount of noise can silence it. There was a strange kind of stillness after the storm, the kind that follows a long battle where every move had been calculated and every word weaponized. The investigation had ended, the noise around Bringer was dying out, and Janice had not only survived, it had become the new industry standard. But as the headlines faded and the meetings turned routine again, I found myself staring at the code late at night, not out of necessity, but out of something quieter and harder to name. Restlessness. For so long, my energy had been directed outward, defending, countering, surviving. Now that the war was over, I had to learn what it meant to build without a threat at my back. And that terrified me more than I expected. Titan Axis continued expanding their investment. We launched new iterations of Janice with predictive insight tools that adapted in real time, and for the first time, I had a full team that didn't just follow. They challenged me, pushed me, brought ideas to the table that made me rethink everything. I had power now, not in the abstract sense of titles or money, but in the deeper sense of influence. My voice shaped roadmaps. My principles shaped hiring. My silence could change a meeting's temperature. And yet, there were moments I still felt like that version of me at Bringer, invisible at the back of the room, trying to prove I deserved to sit at the table. So I built something for her. Not a tool, not a system, but a space. A fellowship. Quietly funded, quietly staffed. A safe, high-impact incubator for engineers and product thinkers who didn't fit the traditional mold. Women, neurodiverse talent, late bloomers, the ones who always almost made it, but got passed over for being too quiet, too blunt, too ambitious. We called it Threadline, after the single fragile thread that had once held me together when Bringer tried to pull me apart. Within 3 months, we had 10 fellows building prototypes that stunned our advisory board. We had journalists asking for interviews, but I declined. This wasn't for the spotlight. This was the apology the industry never gave people like me. And as I watched those fellows speak with confidence I hadn't found until far too late, I realized I wasn't building out of restlessness anymore. I was building from clarity, from freedom. Bringer's name barely came up now, except as a warning in keynotes or a footnote in business ethics seminars. Mark? Gone from LinkedIn. No new ventures, no comeback, just silence. Meanwhile, Janice was being translated into new markets, and Threadline was preparing its first demo day, and I, Hazel R. Chen, was no longer the woman who needed to be discovered. I was the one doing the discovering, and that shift, that quiet turning of the wheel, felt more powerful than any headline. Sometimes, the battles we fight in silence become the foundations of revolutions. Hazel's story is not just about revenge or victory over a toxic workplace. It's about reclaiming authorship of your life, your work, and your voice, even when the system tries to erase you. She didn't win by shouting louder. She won by building smarter, by trusting her process, and by refusing to let bitterness define her legacy. The real triumph wasn't Janice or the investigation's outcome. It was the courage to create a new path where others had only seen dead ends. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed, remember this. You don't need permission to be brilliant. You need clarity, consistency, and the quiet belief that your time will come, and when it does, it won't be for revenge, but for impact. Create not to prove them wrong, but to prove to yourself that you were always right. And when you finally have power, use it to open doors for those still waiting in the hallway. Because legacy isn't about being remembered, it's about making sure others get the chance to be seen.